welcome to the Faculty Lounge, a place for discussing strategies that foster student success. Settle in, get comfy, and let's learn together. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Faculty Lounge podcast. I'm your host, Eric. Let me start that again. I'm your host. It's okay, Jacob. You can just leave it rolling. We'll take care of it later. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Faculty Lounge podcast. I'm your host, Eric Taylor, and joining us today is Kristin Harper.
Hello.
Hi, Kristin. Do you want to give us a little introduction and talk about yourself?
Oh, sure. So I'm an instructor in our World Languages and Cultures department. I'm in the classics section, so I teach some of our Latin classes, ancient Greek, as well as our Gen Eds, the classical mythology class, and from hero to superhero, which was formerly Heroic Quest.
Got it.
Yeah. So I have my background. I have a classics PhD, but I also do classical archaeology. So I most recently was digging on Naxos in Greece in 2019, which was really cool. So I try to implement some of that into my teaching as well. But my personal research focuses on tombstones in ancient Rome around 300, 400s, and I look at the poetry on the stones, specifically tombstones dedicated to young women and kind of telling their stories and things
kind
like
of forgotten.
that. Yeah. Yes, exactly. They're not like elite. They're,
right.
Kind of, I don't know, underdog is the right word,
Sure,
but
yeah. I mean, sure. I think it fits.
Yeah. So I kind of combine the literary and the archaeology together.
That's awesome.
Kind of how I like to think of it. Yeah.
And for those who don't know, the World Languages and Cultures was formerly our Modern and Classical Languages department. So a lot of name changing, a lot of shifting around, but it's the same department we're talking about here.
Yep.
So what inspired you to implement some of the changes you've made in your course? And I guess let's talk about those changes.
Okay.
What are some of the changes you've made?
Well, some of the basic changes at the curriculum level is that we've updated our course descriptions, which some of them hadn't been updated in a decade, and so we have a little bit more a little bit more diverse representation in like the heroes that we study, not just Greco-Roman, but from all corners of the world as well. And that's why we added the name change from hero to superhero, because we also get to talk about some of the superheroes as well.
Very cool.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the students were already making those connections in the classroom, so we felt like, well, why don't we just make this part of the course and make it fun in that regard? Because, when we're talking about cultural competence and things like that, we really want them to, yes, we're learning about a different society and different culture, but how can we also learn about how we analyze the values of another world and maybe start analyzing the values of our own and kind of, develop that cultural humility at the same time.
Sure.
So I think that was kind of our thought process when we started doing some of the curriculum changes. And then this is only my third year here. So I was like, I can kind of have a little bit of autonomy. I can play around with some of the projects that I get to do and things like that. And I was like, I don't think the essays help the students. And I also don't want to be grading 60 plus essays.
I don't blame you.
Yeah. So I started thinking about other ways to implement some of those, analyses, critical thinking, and kind of interaction with the ancient texts, and kind of drawing conclusions, kind of in the safe space of the ancient world, and having these conversations that we can then in turn bring it to our modern day world. So I start doing things like for my From Hero to Superhero project, certain projects, they can pick a variety of different ones, but sometimes they'll analyze like a retelling, or they'll talk about a hero, or when we read Virgil's Aeneid, it's a little hefty of a text, but one of the projects we do in our group discussion is each group has to design what they would, how they would turn it into a film or something, at least the final ending. Which aspect are they going to focus on about Aeneas? Is it his, brutality in the war, or is it Aeneas's kind of piety and duty to his country? Different aspects of that, and we kind of talk about heroism in a variety of different ways in that regard. So I don't know, I could keep going.
No, that's super neat. I love the movie idea. That's great. I'm kind of a movie nerd myself, so that's just super attractive to me. Yeah, that's very cool.
I got to say, I just loved the probably unintentional on your part, but when you were talking about the changes in the culture or in your curriculum, and then kind of bringing it into more inclusivity, and then you actually connected it to a real strategy. I mean, Melanie Cuerva has a adult learning theory strategy, one of my favorites, and that is learning with laughter.
Oh, yes.
And you brought that out with having the students connect to superheroes and bringing in student choice and letting them pick something, and also this idea of the personal response, which is an engaging strategy. So I bet your students are extremely engaged in your class.
I like to think so. I mean, some days more than others, of course.
Yeah, sure. I think everybody can say that.
Right, so, exactly. Yeah, I like to, I think I even talked about it in some of my responses initially, too. I sometimes like to make a fool of myself to get that laughter going. In my language classes in particular, I think, everyone's in college. Singing chants is a little silly, but they will remember those verb endings if I do a little dance. And I sometimes, if I'm asking questions, if I start humming the song or I do the dance, they will start to remember that as well.
Yeah, they're making connections to that, not only with the motions and the kinesthetic movement, but also with the
visual
humor.
Yeah,
and the emotional impact. There's a connection between emotion and memory, and so and the physical movement. So it sounds really intriguing. It sounds like I want to be in your class.
Oh, please come join us. The more the merrier. I just really love what I do, so I hope it kind of comes out.
You can tell. And that, when you first sat down, I was thinking that. I was like, oh my word, the passion of a professor for their content is something that is very engaging, and sometimes I think that we forget that when we worry so much about the technical aspects of teaching and learning. But when you really start with that kind of exuberant passion for your own content, it's contagious. Just letting students know and see that you love this. And I could tell that. I don't know. I'm not even sure everything that you teach, but I'm ready to learn. Ready to find out.
Well said.
We don't want to diminish the power that is there in the passion that professors and teachers can bring to their subject and their content.
Right. That's why I don't do essays anymore.
And that holistic style learning is just more. It's more broad. It's just it covers more bases. It feels like it's a more complete way to learn when you're trying to teach.
Yeah, I I actually got a micro grant my first year here from the FCTL to make this ancient replica study collection, and I felt one of the things that I do in my own research that kind of permeates my teaching is, okay, what's the everyday life of these people, right? I'm focusing on the non-elite women, so what were their lives like? But we read these texts about these elites and, what are the priests doing? What are the gods doing? What are the emperors doing in ancient Rome? But I think being able to actually touch something, or I got one of the gladius practice swords, and you can kind of feel it in your hand, and we got some ancient Egyptian perfume and ancient Roman incense, so you can kind of get the smells and kind of this multi-sensory aspect, because I think in some regard, the ancients are so ancient and distant from us, but then we're reading poems that are like the ones on the tombstones, so evocative with grief or love and friendship and the heroism. And so it's kind of, I don't know, I feel like being able to touch something or to actually see an example, you can't touch I have a replica Helix, which is like a wine glass. You can't touch that in the museum, but the copy that I have, you can touch.
Absolutely, yeah.
We have a loom, so you can practice weaving, just like Penelope in Homer's Odyssey is weaving the shroud to Laertes, and I think it kind of helps to bring it a little bit closer, and we can kind of understand a little bit more everyday stuff as we're going in conjunction with what's happening in the ancient world and what are some similarities and differences between our cultures.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, making connections everywhere. There's so much research on the importance of making connections, and sometimes you think about that as one-dimensional, but you just mentioned so many connections, connections to the past, connections to the future. You connected it to the present, and then you connected it with tactile touch and the use of sensation and the actual personal connections that students are making with your content. content. Yeah. Talk about bringing it to life. And then you talked about using that as a strategy for identifying similarities and differences, which is a high yield instructional strategy. To take time and let students think about what is the same, what is different. It seems simple, but sometimes those things aren't necessarily intentionally in place or even thought about as how impactful that can be for your students. I'm sure that it is. I'm sure you're finding that being impactful. I think so.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And something I also started doing recently, kind of like post-pandemic, is I used to do a lot of big group discussions, and now I do a lot of, we break off into subgroups, and either each group will have the same question or a variety of questions or come up with questions, and I find it so interesting when we come back together as a big group and kind of talk about each group's answers, what things are similar and what things are different. And I think it also get students to talk a little bit more, because sometimes it's scary speaking in front of the whole classroom to me, right? And when they're in the small groups, they can talk to each other, feel a little bit more comfortable.
Less intimidating.
Yeah, it's safer. Yeah. There's some safety in that peer learning.
Yeah, exactly.
So did 2020 instigate or cause any of these changes in your classroom?
I started doing a lot more small group afterwards.
Really?
I noticed, I also switched institutions, so it could have been institutional, but I noticed when I started doing the big group discussions, not as many people were, raising hands and willing to chat afterwards, and I was like, well, it makes sense. We've been on screens for, a little while, so I had done a lot of small groups for my Latin classes before, doing charts or teaching different grammar constructions to each other, because I know that's how I learned some of my grammar. It's I picked whichever grammar construction I was horrible at, and I tried to teach it to somebody else. So I did it with my language courses, but I started implementing it into our larger gen ed classes as well.
So the timing was just perfect.
Yeah, it was.
Well, and to get the social interaction back going again within a safe environment, within that peer learning, idea. One of the questions I think I would have that might be helpful for other teachers out there, it always is an issue, is just how do you manage the group structures as far as there's always you send students out to be in groups and then you want to pull them back. Do you have any advice for some kind of strategies for how you're managing the break, let's go to group, and then how to bring them back? Queuing, I guess, is what I'm talking about. Okay. It sounds like you're doing enough of it that you might have some queuing strategies that could help other people. It's something I always struggle with. What's the best method for...
Well, I don't know if I have a best method, but what I tend to do is I'll break them up in groups, and depending on, I kind of get a sense of how much talking is going on. Like if people have finished, kind of wrapped up their conversations, or they've pulled out their phones or something, then I'm like, okay, well, maybe they didn't need as much time as I thought with that. I tend to go to each group, and if I've given them a list of questions or something, I'll say, do you need a few more minutes, or are you ready to wrap up? So they kind of know that that's coming. And also I'll go to each group. Maybe we'll chat about something if they have questions, and then I kind of try to... I'll be like, all right. I don't know. I use my teacher voice.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
So kind of bring them all back together that way. So I guess maybe I notify them, okay, take 1 or 2 more minutes.
Yeah, you've given them warning. You've gone around and checked in. You also monitored their learning, and you knew it was time to go before you did it. That's always a good thing. That's really, that's really great. Right. I think that's very helpful. That is something that is a strategy that's really hard to manage, is grouping structures. It just is.
Yeah. I think especially online.
Oh, yeah.
It presents so many extra challenges. So, for sure. For sure. Yeah. So I want to know what your students' reactions were like. How did your students take these? What was have you gotten feedback? What did you notice?
I've gotten, mostly positive feedback from these. A lot of people tell me, so I also do a series of creative projects. My very first semester teaching here was all online, and I had them do a comparative essay between an ancient Greek or Roman myth with a modern retelling. I got a lot of Troy movies. But while they were good, I kind of wanted to, ease up on my grading time, because I'm an instructor, so I teach a 4-4, and some of these classes can be pretty big. And I wanted to give students a little bit more variety. So I switched to doing creative projects along with my normal other assessments in my classical mythology class. And I give them an option to make an Instagram account for an ancient god and what they would be doing in the modern world. So I've seen a couple, Zeus as like a CEO of an electric company, Hermes as a travel blogger, Aphrodite as a beauty influencer, Artemis as an animal and women's rights activist. So I've gotten some really cool things. And then but their other option, if they don't want to do something like that, would be to do a Homeric hymn, writing in the style of these Homeric hymns, but praising maybe a modern person, someone they look up to, a character that they like, or a historical figure. And so I like to see this blending of ancient and modern, and what are like kind of the values that they pick out from each of those. And so I've gotten really positive feedback on those creative projects.
Nice.
I also have a series on, I have lots more on From Hero to Superhero class. We do kind of, I call it our Homeric, or heroic quest, and we take a journey with all of our different projects and stuff. So I've gotten pretty good feedback on that. I don't know if I've seen like a significant difference mentioning my group discussions, but for my peer reviews, people have noticed my rapport with my students, and I think one way that I build rapport with my students is kind of giving them that space to talk with each other, and then interacting with them more one-on-one.
Yeah, that flexibility is tremendous. It's tremendous.
Yeah.
I also make a lot of bad puns. So
hey, yeah.
That's the humor again.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So you've been mentioning so many strategies that are really heavy planning. I mean, you really are talking about some things that require some upfront on your part as an instructor, as a teacher. That kind of pre-planning that goes into it. Sometimes I think that's a little bit of an inhibitor for people to maybe try some of these strategies, because it does require an investment of planning and time. So can you just share a little bit about kind of the cost reward benefit of that? Is it worth the amount of time that you're spending planning these high level learning opportunities for your students by you're bringing in tactile objects for them to touch. You're talking about developing grouping structures, which takes a lot of planning, spatial planning in your classroom. You're talking about having choice in assignments so that students can do this or that, like an adventure novel. I can go this way or I can go that way. And you're allowing a lot of flexibility and freedom in that learning for your students. That requires so much upfront. I know that it does. So can you just talk a little bit to teachers out there who might be wondering, is all that investment really worth the payout that you've gotten? And what are some of the things that you've seen that were benefits?
I think it is definitely worth it. It can be a lot of work. But then I also think back on like where I was previously teaching, giving like 3 essays a semester in a large classical mythology class. I was grading so much. And while, I have a literary background, I love essays. I think they're great. I felt like it was more impactful for students coming into my gen ed courses, especially, who maybe are getting that writing, critical thinking aspect from the written communication standpoint from their other gen ed classes. I thought it might be more impactful for them to kind of hone into that cultural competency, and talking about heroes, what are our values, and maybe the questions that they aren't getting in other classes. So when I kind of compared it that way, it was a lot of upfront work, but I also teach the classes fairly often. So, and I also don't try to do too much. Like when I first started, I just added one project.
That's a great tip. Yeah.
One
at a time.
Yeah, exactly. And I did an upper level comparative mythology class, and I hadn't fully fleshed out. I had several options, and I talked to my students. They were upper level students, and I said, okay, this is what I'm thinking for your final project. What do you guys want to do? So we ended up kind of coming up with a final project together. It was a smaller class. It was like maybe 8 to 10 students, and we decided, a variety of different options for them, and so they kind of helped me help them and kind of get out what they wanted for the course. And that was the first time I taught that class. So now I can use that whenever I teach it again.
I actually graduated electronic arts here, and that's how that program is.
Awesome.
We all come up with our own final, if you will. And we spend a whole year working on it. And it was fantastic. It ensures that everyone's actually wanting to do this. So many times I see, especially like undergraduate seniors, get so bogged down because it's just work. It's just work. They're just trying to get a degree. If you actually care about it, it makes such a difference.
Right.
So that's so good to hear.
Well, and you're allowing so much ownership in the work that way, letting the students take ownership and leadership and kind of manage their own learning and their own thinking, and then you're just providing the resources and facilitating them. And I love that you mentioned that, teaching is work either way.
Yes, it is.
And so you kind of have to choose what the bigger investment is.
Right.
And it sounds like you've chosen to invest your time in the development of real strong research-based strategies to make an impact on your student learning, and then you can enjoy them in the class time.
Right.
And it sounds like you're seeing some impact on the students. So can you talk a little bit about the impacts that your students have? Have you seen a difference in impact as far as their learning goes? I'm sure they're enjoying it immensely. Have you seen any impact to the actual learning that they acquire, the knowledge and skills they acquire from your course?
I think so, because at least, and the quality of their projects as well. I think when they're passionate about, or they're interested in, either if they've taken one of these flexible options or have a little fun with it, I feel like I have a better quality of project and work from them. Like for that comparative myth class, I had one student who was planning on going to graduate school for classics, and so wrote a standard, research paper. But then I had another student who was in creative writing, and they wrote all of these retellings using various different structures that we talked about, certain comparative mythology theory and things like that were kind of embedded within their story collection that they did, like a series of short stories. So I think I get better responses that way. I guess better quality, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think it helps on the other end when we do have kind of more traditional assessments like a test or essay or things like that. Especially with the classical mythology class, I always like to tell them one of my goals for them is, even if my funny goals are that they know Disney's Hercules gets things wrong, but that they can go to any art show or art museum or something like that and be able to recognize some of the hidden gems. And so when they have an Instagram project and they have to pick out some of those objects from the paintings or sculptures I show in class, they have to recreate those. And so I feel like they do better on, I have an image identification section normally on the midterm and the final, and I feel like they recognize some of those a little bit better than before when I wasn't doing that.
It's that
project.
application of knowledge. You're kind of they're applying what they learned from you. So it's awesome.
Yeah, it sounds like it. The higher level thinking skills are being used there with the application and recreating. So I'm sure that they will have no problem with anything they do. It sounds like you're really connecting it to real life applications. I've heard you say that. Can you talk a little bit about that? You talked about that so much with kind of bringing the past into the present. You've connected it with superheroes, but then you just talked about how your assignments and your tasks were actually geared for the student to actually take what they've learned in your class and apply the knowledge in a way that's going to be part of their journey in life, kind of which direction they're going. Can you talk a little bit more about that kind of real life application that you're putting in place?
Okay, I could probably talk forever about the ancient world and humanities and impact. But when a student comes in and steps into my classroom, they're probably not going to become a classicist like me or go and do an archaeological dig. And we don't even have a major anymore. We have minors, and we have some certificate programs and things. So I'm coming from the place of, you're probably not going to do what I do, but these are things that I find that what we can learn in this classroom can be applicable not just to maybe your professional life, but to your growth as a person and interacting in society and culture, being more receptive to, the cultures around you. And, like I said, it's kind of like a safe space in the ancient world. We can talk about these people in maybe a more critical way than we can about other areas and modern peoples today. And so we can be like, okay, this is the Romans did XYZ. That is very different from how modern Americans, go to the bathhouse or, different things like that. And so I think it's one way that we can, like I said, analyze certain things, but also think critically about our own life. But then I also think there's some practical applications too, right? I always talk about how many advertisements use like ancient gods and goddesses, lots of marketing stuff going in there.
Men's deodorant.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
Exactly. And so being able to like pick those things out, to recognize patterns, and sometimes to have hard discussions. Like in classical mythology, we deal with issues of rape and slavery and a creation of otherness. Sometimes we talk about ancient Athens and Sparta. And, I just talked about this the other day in the Odyssey, and how Odysseus looks down on Polyphemus and some of the people who are barbarians, non-Greeks. And so we're having some kind of difficult conversations about some of these things, but we're able to talk about them in, the realm of mythology, gods. We can insult Zeus and not feel, maybe, depending, you don't want the thunder to come down. But so I think I hope that I'm allowing this space that we can talk about these things, so that then they can go off and have these conversations in their own lives, and maybe just kind of think about, okay, we've learned all of these differences. What are some of the things that are the same? Yeah. We read Catullus in my Latin class the other day, and he's this kind of cheeky love poet, and he has a really famous poem that uses the subjunctive, which we were learning the subjunctive, but it's vivamus, let us live. He says, my Lesbia, which is his girlfriend, the historical Clodia, and then he says, amamus, let us love, and it's all about, my students keep calling him thirsty, because he goes on and talks about all of the kisses that he wants and all of this, and so I think it's really great when we can talk about someone who is living 2,000 years ago, having very similar emotions to what they might be experiencing now. Yeah. And I don't think we always think about that. We're like,
using modern terms to describe them.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, and sometimes like we talk about medicine and stuff, we're like, the ancients thought this was this and that was that, but okay, they're doing the best they could with what they had, and they're not getting everything right, but neither are we. But we can kind of share. I like to really see that light bulb when they're like, oh wow, like I get what he's saying here. I get what they're trying to argue, or I feel bad for Queen Dido.
Yeah, you have really made connections there to things, human conditions. The connections to grief and to love and to laughter, all of that, the different the humanness. Yeah. The humanness that is the same today as it was then.
Right.
It feels so personal. Everything feels so personal in your class. Yeah.
There's personal relevance. That's really interesting, considering the course material that you're teaching, to be able to use those strategies that you're using in order to bring the ancient civilizations into a level of personal relevance for your students, through those real life connections, applications of those concepts, and then the humor and bringing in just the safe space to be able to have that kind of conversation around there. So it's very intriguing.
And I'm glad you flattered me.
Intriguing. I think I want to take your class.
Yeah, please do. Fall 2023, right?
Yeah, right. Nice. So do you have any like resources, or do you have any inspiration behind this, or any tools that you use, or anything you might recommend? Say somebody wants to follow in your footsteps.
Okay.
Give them a little checklist. Like, here's my quick tips and tricks. Right.
Well, I am kind of indebted to the internet.
Sure. Sure.
And I actually took some of when I was a graduate student, I taught at an elementary school. I did a Latin club for elementary school students. So I turned to Pinterest for all of these projects that other teachers were doing, and I kind of got, well, obviously I'm not doing the same level of stuff. I kind of took inspiration for, okay, how can I use this, elementary school project and apply that to, to my university level class. And so I kind of got inspiration from those. I talk to other colleagues and see what they're doing in other places too. And I like to do my own spin on stuff. So I might say, oh, you're doing XYZ. I'm going to, make me use that idea and kind of. So I think talking to other people at other universities, seeing what maybe if there's a different level of your subject, what they might be doing to, I think sometimes we get stuck in this idea, oh, we're university, we're college level,
right?
Students, need to be sitting down and be very disciplined and all this other stuff. But, I put stickers on my quizzes.
For sure.
And if I taught high school, maybe they wouldn't care, but my college students love the stickers that I have. Yeah. And I think it eases, maybe they're receiving a bad grade or something like that. But also I think it helps, I don't know, I hope it helps the rapport a little bit.
Yeah.
Hey, you can come chat with me about this quiz grade. Yeah. And it provides a little bit of fun. So I don't know, I would encourage people to, look at what other people are doing, not just at the university level, but at the other levels, or even in the professional world too, right? What makes at training purposes or different things like that work, and what things maybe don't work. Like, I think about some of the trainings I have to go through and what was dull and what wasn't dull, and those sorts of things. I guess. Yeah.
And you just hit on that with the idea of spreading out and looking for strategies outside of your comfort level or your immediate space to be able to find those strategies, and thinking about the idea that research-based and effective instructional strategies and learning strategies, they know no age. Exactly. The truly effective learning strategies that we know of are not specifically designed for K-12 versus a university level. Now, there are strategies that would be specifically targeted to teaching reading, for instance. You're going to talk about phonemic awareness at that level, but I'm talking about the actual engagement strategies, or
the overall
instructional strategies, grouping strategies, facilitation of learning strategies. Those strategies know no age.
Right.
So, I love that you're talking about going out and looking across the board and being okay with just really going out there and trying some things, finding and seeing what works, what doesn't work. Thinking about trying new things.
You're not restricting yourself like, I'm the professor, I know this. You know what I mean? You're constantly learning.
You're a learner.
You're challenging what you know. You're seeking out others,
Yeah.
That's a skill, straight up.
Skill.
Like that's
it is a skill.
And I think about a musician. It makes a musician a better one to play with folks who are better than they are. And it's the same thing when you're teaching.
Yeah.
If you can talk with people that have different strategies that work just as well or even better, that's not going to do you any damage.
Right. It's called practice, because you're just trying some things out and seeing if they work, if they don't work. And, you've got to figure out what works for you and your students and evaluate. It sounds like you're really doing a lot of reflective thinking.
Yeah, it sounds like you're well on your way. So.
Yeah. Well, I didn't see that in the materials that I had ahead of time about reflective thinking. But after talking with you, I'm curious if you have any insights or anything you might share with others about how you prepare. How are you preparing your learning? Because it's obvious that you're spending time thinking and evaluating. So is there anything you can share with the listeners about your thinking process?
Okay. Well, I do have an open I have one document on my computer that I keep of just project ideas, and I kind of add to it, or if I'm away and see something, I keep a list of notes on my phone and I'll add to it later. I also talk to some of my friends and I'm just like, what did you wish you would have done in this class? And then, I think it's really important that I be myself in my classes. So I might take some of their ideas and say, okay, how can that work for my class? And how do I make it my own, I guess? So I think just kind of keeping an open mind, and you just keep a running list. And at one time, you might be like, I can't fit that in right now. I don't have time to update this. Maybe over the summer I'll revisit. So like myself this summer, I'm thinking, okay, I want to redo XYZ project. That rubric, I didn't anticipate some of these issues. So next semester I'll update the rubric. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel every single time. Right. And I think it is a process of reevaluating. And so I keep a list. I ask other people when we go to conferences. Sometimes this stuff kind of comes up, or sometimes I'll go to for the Society of Classical Studies and the Archaeological Institute of America, they might have a pedagogy panel. So sometimes I'll go to those and see what those are. And I took a National Humanities Institute course last summer called GIS in the Humanities Classroom. And while a lot of the stuff didn't quite pertain to everything that I do, it was more geared for K through 12 social studies courses. I was like, well, I can bring in maps a lot more. We can kind of talk about the ancient world using some of these other ways of looking at data. And I eventually want to add one of those and I offered it as an option for one of my projects and no one took me up on it, but I kind of want to slowly add some of those things that I'm learning through my professional development into those things. So I just feel like even though I've written my syllabus and I, stick mostly to it throughout from semester to semester, I feel like we can always update and change what works, what didn't work. If someone else has a great idea, why not utilize that and kind of see how it fits? Or I even sometimes talk to my students too at the end of the semester.
That's great.
Did you guys like this project?
Yeah.
What would you have rather we have done? What are you interested in? Like I said, I had a couple students, they were going to grad school, so the research project made sense for them.
Sure.
But other students, it didn't.
Yep.
So kind of trying to be flexible, trying to keep my own boundaries, but I think if it's, playing the long game, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you're invested in your students' learning, clearly. That's the long game.
I mean, and you're talking about you're talking about bringing in differentiated structures, trying to meet each individual student needs and personalizing their learning. So, I'm not surprised that your students are engaged in your course at all. I would imagine that would be the case with the strategies that you're sharing.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a great conversation today. Thanks, Kristin, again for coming in. Kristin Harper, our guest today. For all our listeners, I want to thank you for tuning in again to the Faculty Lounge podcast. I'm Eric Taylor, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for being part of the Faculty Lounge. Join us next time, and let's learn together.